If you want, should I put a link in my Instagram story so I can notify people that
Later,
it's
later,
okay?
later.
Okay.
Ok. Bueno, bienvenidos con todos a un episodio más de Navarra Confidencial. Yo soy Ugo Stornaiolo y como siempre estoy dirigiendo este programa de disertaciones libres al que hemos titulado En Orden, Libertad. Y ahora me acompaña una invitada bastante especial porque es una de las primeras mujeres que invitamos en esta nueva sección del programa. Habíamos invitado a otras antes, pero desde que lo volvimos a reiniciar es la primera vez que tenemos a otra dama en el canal. Y es Angelica Grass, que para los que conocen ha sido una productora de contenidos ASMR por un tiempo y actualmente está envuelta en, bueno, una serie de cosas bastante interesantes que han cambiado su perspectiva. Así que, welcome, Angelica. It's
Gracias,
good to have you
gracias
here.
por tenerme.
Ok, voy a hacer las preguntas en español y eventualmente en inglés. Angélica probablemente nos responde en inglés porque es el contenido un poco más profundo, así que va a ser bilingüe ahora. All right, Angélica. Si es que podrías un poco introducirte y decirnos quién eres, qué has hecho, cómo llegaste a este punto, te agradecería. Es la primera pregunta que solemos hacer.
My name is Angelica. I've done ASMR on YouTube for about 7 years, and I also have a second channel, but on that one, I usually just post whatever thoughts pop into my head. Um, and the way I got to this point is basically like I was an atheist for about 6 years. When I began the channel on my YouTube, on my main YouTube channel, I had basically lost my faith in the Jehovah's Witnesses because since the Jehovah's Witnesses are basically like a Protestant of a Protestant of a Protestant faith, unless you have like a bigger doctrine outside of just believing in God, if you lose that faith in God, considering how the church itself doesn't really have anything else to kind of like feed you, there's no grander philosophy, no history, no nothing, atheism becomes like a very natural path. So for the 6 years in which I was managing my YouTube channel, I kind of went through the atheist lens of like basically exploring everything of the world, especially essentially, and like kind of doing whatever videos I felt like doing at the time. But then with the way that the world is kind of shifting and with understanding how deeper politics are navigating itself, I started to kind of observe patterns that were reflected in the Bible that I grew up with. But because I still had a very atheist mind, I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Like in on an intellectual level, biblical prophecies are kind of coming true, but I didn't really have that faith come to me yet.
Ujú.
Um, and furthermore, I wanted to kind of like reacquaint myself with Proverbs just because that was the favorite book of a loved one of mine. And yeah, I ended up, short story quick, just kind of jumping into like Catholicism about a month afterwards, and then kind of like realizing this is actually real. And then when I came out as being Catholic, or at least studying with Catholics, I kind of keep my eye a little bit on orthodoxy, but I've been more so on the path with Catholics. Um, People started to immediately kind of, I could kind of see the leftist rhetoric, I could kind of see the leftist sort of like ideology for those that are really like in the left or really like liberal kind of popping out. And I was like, oh, I see. And then I don't know, it kind of created this whole whirlwind that I kind of just fed into, just because I realized like this really is Satan's world, and it's going to basically use Satan's tactics to kind of like manipulate everything around you essentially. So yeah, very long intro, but yeah, that's kind of the whole gist of it.
No, no, bueno, es bastante resumido porque han pasado muchas cosas y al menos yo que alguna vez vi uno de tus videos en YouTube, me acuerdo muy bien qué video era. It's the one where you play the nun in the play.
Sí, yeah. Esa es la
Y
más famosa.
ya, y entonces justamente como uno tiene esa idea, de la nada empieza a ver que tu contenido va cambiando y te preguntas, ¿qué pasó aquí? O sea, primero que nada, el ASMR es un poco niche para la mayor parte de gente. No, no es que sea un mercado tan extenso como el de cualquier otro influencer. Y en segundo lugar, también está el tema de que suele ser un mercado muy, no te diría de izquierda, pero sí es algo muy que se enfoca a gente que es solitaria.
Mhm.
Because when you have a community around, you don't really rely on, YouTube videos and that. And I know that because cuando vivía en mi país, estaba con mi familia y todo, y ahora que vivo fuera de mi país, estoy un poco más solo y demás, y te vas dando cuenta de esas dinámicas. So, well, can hear a quick question about like your professional background doing ASMR, and how you came to do that, and like, what's like the experience. Luego voy a hablar de todo el cambio que has tenido y un poco cómo se dio más a profundidad.
Well, when I was about, I think, 16, I fell across the ASMR genre, but that was before it blew up the way it did. Because now it's like a weird market, but it exploded. Like now it's just like ubiquitous. Even, everyone basically mentions it, even if it's as a joke or if it's in passing or whatever. But back in the day, like it was like considered the whisper community, or it was considered like a very niche, small community of like 20 or 30 people, essentially. So I started making videos just kind of like in the corner of my room, just kind of thinking I'm being funny, I'm being goofy with these weird people here, and that's about it. And like, as you mentioned, like I was still a Jehovah's Witness. I was still attending Jehovah's Witness meetings at the time, but I was kind of like losing my faith just because it can be a little bit grating, that religion, especially how isolated it removes you from the body of Christ, essentially, where it's like, unless you're a Jehovah's Witness, you can't have any relationship with another Christian, and that can damage your relationship with Christ. So I would kind of make it in the corner of my room, and then about like a year or two later, the genre blew up, and I kind of rode that wave that honestly knocked a lot of the original creators off, because no one expected to basically be exposed to the public to that massive of a scale. But in my brain, I just couldn't comprehend what was going on. So I just kept going along with it. And I was like, all right, like, this is just me putting a video online. No one's watching this. It's just numbers on a screen. And then when you would go outside, someone would like cross the street to be like, oh my God. And you're like, who are you? So yeah, that's basically how it happened.
Right, but you still, dentro de la comunidad SMR, tenías una fama de ser un poco más like weird or rara o very, very special in your content. It was different from the rest.
Sí.
Y eso se mantuvo hasta hace muy poco, y más bien ahí vi que, o sea, vi que el resto de tus seguidores vieron un cambio repentino. Tú ya me explicaste que es un poco porque tuviste esta transición desde los Jehovah's Witnesses hasta el ateísmo, y luego por una cosa te inclinaste hacia el catolicismo, y quería preguntarte justamente, ¿qué fue lo que te hizo inclinar hacia el catolicismo?
Well, it's like when you experience the world and what it has to offer, essentially. Like it's public information, so I suppose I could reference it. About 2 years ago, unfortunately, my mother passed away, and it was quite sudden. And I knew that in that vulnerable position, that there was going to be plenty of people basically offering me their religion, whether it was Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or whatever. I knew that there was going to be some denomination coming along telling me, be part of our religion. And having been raised a Jehovah's Witness, I already knew that protocol where it's like, when someone gets a divorce, here's a tract for that. When someone loses a loved one or whatever. So I avoided it for about 2 years. But when you avoid religion, especially when confronted with death, or when you avoid something that can basically explain that process, you start to truly understand how, if you don't believe in a God, or if you don't believe in something higher than yourself, the world itself becomes very evident, I guess. I can't quite explain it. It's like you start to understand the hollowness of people who don't have faith. You start to understand how empty the world is. You start to understand how the material world is in and of itself self-destructive without the presence of God. But even with those elements in mind, I still thought, well, that's just normal and that's natural and that's just what's to be expected. And I just need to adapt to it and be fine with it. But I was also engaging in heavy leftist politics as well. And in my pursuit of better understanding or studying leftist politics, I came across certain philosophies and subjects that have historical roots back since like the late 1800s that basically normalized hurting children, essentially. And it wasn't until I confronted that, it was like within the school of anarchy. It wasn't until I confronted that and I started asking all of my leftist friends who were like active in the scene or whatever. I was like, what do you think about this? Like, I've never known that this existed. Like, I don't know like what to make of this essentially. And none of them really cared. None of them, that wasn't like their goal. That wasn't like their direction. That wasn't a value of theirs. And I kept asking more and more people, and they kept saying, who cares? Just stay quiet. Who cares? Just stay quiet. And just that reaction started to annoy me deeply. And I started to feel like, even though for myself, you know, I can accept that this material world exists and there's nothing beyond this, I can't possibly accept that this level of evil and cruelty can exist without some, like, you have to use moralistic religious language to describe that evil. You can't use secular language to describe that level of evil. So that's kind of when I started turning to Proverbs to kind of get closer to my mom who had passed away, because that was her favorite book. And as I was reading the book, where before when I was younger, I would read the Bible and kind of feel like this doesn't make sense. It's historical. It's old. It's just, it doesn't like click with me. This time around, when I was reading Proverbs, it was like a fresh book. Like it could have been written in today's time, essentially. And then I read Isaiah and Job and Ecclesiastes. And I basically started going through every book in the Bible, Jeremiah. And all of it basically was like telling you what's going on nowadays. And I was like, oh, so obviously then comes the choice of, well, what Christian denomination are you going to choose then? Like Baptists and evangelists are pretty much the predominant faith in this country. So I've always leaned towards Catholicism and Orthodoxy because I would read like a lot of their philosophy and history and stuff like that. But there were obviously some issues and concerns that I had, particularly with the Catholic Church, considering like the whole scandals and whatnot, that gave me a little bit of hesitation to kind of go the Catholic route. And with the Orthodox route, I was like, well, this would be completely fresh information for me. But then I started finding statistics like, oh, well, you know, like when it came to like the priests, for example, it's like, of course, that was a scandal that was insane. But there's like, I think they came out with a new study where they found that the rate of public school teachers hurting children is like 100 times higher than that of priests. And that the priests that were found with those scandals, like 1% of them were the ones that were convicted of being guilty and they went to prison. 3% of them were found innocent. So I'm like, okay, that dynamic is interesting, because then by that logic, if I decide not to become Catholic, then by that logic, I shouldn't also have ever gone to public school, and I shouldn't even watch any Hollywood movies, which then I started kind of piecing it all together, and I was like, wait a minute, but Hollywood was the one making movies about the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, Hollywood is like embedded within how it like hurts children, essentially. I started basically kind of like unraveling it all. And then like, yeah, it's like all of it started to make sense, where I was like, this is a tragedy, but the way that the world interpreted this tragedy was as a scandal and as content and as vulgarity that they now kind of capitalize off of. So that made me more comfortable to go the Catholic route. Plus, Catholicism is my heritage. Like my mom left the Catholic Church to become a Jehovah's Witness, and then I left Jehovah's Witnesses to become an atheist, and now we've made the full return, I guess.
Sí, sí, por supuesto. Y bueno, sobre lo que indicabas que es un tema de estadísticas, pues hay, no te diría estudios, pero hay demostraciones que indican que toda la estadística de abusos que supuestamente ha hecho la iglesia están extrapoladas de datos que ni siquiera son muy fiables, especialmente de datos en Francia, de donde sacaron el número de 15% a 40% y demás. Y cuando te das cuenta de eso, empiezas a ver, ok, ¿quién está manejando los datos? ¿Quién difunde los datos? ¿Quién promueve los datos? ¿A quién le beneficia? Y un poco de ese punto te vuelves escéptico de la narrativa oficial y de lo que han promovido y lo que la mayor parte de gente piensa. Tus compañeros en la universidad, tus amigos y demás, todos repiten lo mismo. Entonces, un poco cuando sales de eso, te quedas un poco solo y tal vez esta es tu experiencia con lo que ha pasado con tu canal y con tus redes. Y quería preguntarte justamente cómo has tomado todo ese cambio y la respuesta de tus seguidores en estos últimos meses.
I've always been someone who's been very like independent in mind, independent in thought. So although before like it seemed like I was obviously catering to the market and like really caring about what other people think, I've never had that complex. Like I've never really cared what other people, like the entire group could be against me, but if I have like reason and facts for believing what it is that I believe, I don't care who likes me or dislikes me. And that's always been my personality and stance. It's just before, when you're an atheist, you casually do agree with everyone else. But if you have to go against the grain, then you'll go against the grain. For me, as for the backlash and as for the response, number one, I understand that it's a vocal minority, where it's just like, it's just a small chunk of my audience that basically had this misinterpretation of my audience, or yeah, of what composes my audience, and has this misinterpretation of who I am and who I've always been and all of that jazz. That's to be expected when you're in the public eye, where people think that they have this idea of who you are, and it's a mirror reflection of who they are, essentially. And then they feel betrayed when you don't reflect them back to them. And it's like, that's congratulations. I also had a similar thing when it came to the Beatles, just kind of deal with it. But I also do appreciate a lot of the Christian global community that's also reached out, where it's like they would tell me how, they felt so sad when they would see my content that would make fun of religion and all of that jazz, and how they knew that there was something more there, but they knew that I was struggling. And I think in that you can kind of see where it's not something that I necessarily needed, because like I'll basically, bash the gaffet or something like that. I can't quite remember the expression, but like if I have to, it's kind of like Samson, where it's like just kind of like pushing the pillars, essentially. Like I don't care. But seeing that sort of like reflection of how God and Satan works, basically, of like how you can basically spend 7 years bashing Christianity, bashing like all the teachings, the community, and all of that jazz. And there's still going to be Christians there, kind of understanding that there's something deeper, kind of understanding your humanity and all of that jazz. Then you start to criticize the world and how it's gearing itself up, and how you're objectively bringing all of this information, all of this philosophy that you found on your own, having been so deep into it. And then you're going to start getting people who basically misinterpret your words on purpose, or start to slander you, or start to accuse you of things that you didn't say or didn't do, and start to kind of like amp up this sort of like burn the witch sort of like mob mentality, essentially. And I don't know, it's like that like obvious fact just kind of makes me laugh. It doesn't even like affect me. It's just like in and of itself a hilarious reality of like, this is where the truth is, and this is where the deception lies, essentially. So it's been an interesting like it's been an interesting social experiment. So yeah, that's about the extent of it.
Claro, o sea, yo lo entiendo así también, y no es que tenga una experiencia parecida, pero al menos dentro de lo que es la derecha, the right, y siempre tienes gente que es más, a little bit more libertarian and more traditionalist in a sense. Y algunos grupos no se lo toman muy a bien que estés en medio y que un poco compenses ideas, entonces ya depende de cuál es el grupo que te acoge más, y sobre todo que se acerca más a lo que es la verdad, lo bueno, lo bello, lo verdadero.
Mm-hmm.
Y hablando de eso, quería preguntarte del otro canal, del canal de video essays que tienes. Me puse a revisar algunos de los que has subido, y bueno, el tema más reciente es justamente cómo te vas contra toda la industria justamente de lo que es OnlyFans y demás, y quería preguntarte cómo ves tú el fenómeno actualmente, o sea, qué es lo que pasó después de la pandemia y demás, y sobre el daño que hace.
Well, I think that there's a common question that people are asking themselves, which is, why is it so normalized? Like, why are so many girls doing it? Where it's like millions upon millions of girls have now gotten an OnlyFans, and now they're treating digital prostitution as if it's just a trend, to such a degree where I've received messages and comments of how teenage girls in high school, who are typically like, the nerdy girls who feel like ugly ducklings, they feel pressured now to get an OnlyFans when they graduate, to keep up with the popular girls who are already posting photos of themselves online. And it's becoming so normalized that now young girls are being educated, as I was too when I was younger, like 14, as these girls are also that age, and like even 11-year-old girls are being introduced to this type of material, that it's empowering to post photos of yourself online, that it's empowering to basically embrace your sexuality. These are all concepts that are proven empirically to worsen your mental health, no matter what kind of society you live in. Like it's objective that there's natural consequences that come from this. If you are someone who has any level of insecurity, it's going to be exploded. If you're someone who has any level of psychological complex, this is not the means to resolve that. And I hate how it's being so normalized to a degree where these young girls who go on there don't fully understand the consequences of their actions, because since they've only lived like 18, 20, 23 years on Earth, they don't understand the grand scope of how they're going to feel about it when they're 30 or 35 or 40, and the high levels of girls who end up, hurting themselves to a point where they, basically don't live anymore. I've seen that happen so many times now, where it's like about 4 girls now that aren't with us anymore, all as a consequence of having engaged in this type of material. And those deaths are basically used as a reason for why, by basically what I would like to call the madams, like the older women I would say that are more my age, women who already have experience in this, or who drink the liberal feminist Kool-Aid, who try to normalize this industry as if it's something empowering and liberating, which is in itself a industry talking point, where they're trying to basically recruit more girls into it. They'll use those deaths as a means to say, oh, well, because these girls died, that's a reflection of how this industry is so shamed. You should do it to normalize it, so that way girls don't die anymore. It's heavily manipulative language that is for the reason why I just don't care when people start to use crocodile tears or start to use these sort of like hyperbolic, like emotionally charged rhetoric. Cause I'm like, I'm already familiar with it all. I've already heard it all. It's like, I get it. Like, it's all just deception essentially. So yeah, I can't stomach it. And OnlyFans isn't going to be the last one either. There's always going to be another industry and another one and another one. And it's heavy.
Sí, y bueno, ya que mencionaste el tema del feminist Kool-Aid, tú como alguien que estabas muy a la izquierda, te nutriste mucho de esas ideas. Mencionaste también el anarquismo hace algunas preguntas, y por aquí lo que quería preguntarte es, ¿cómo ves el cambio de esas ideas a lo que estás expresando ahora? Y sobre todo, eh, ¿qué es lo que más te decepcionó de lo que solías pensar antes?
I would say that growing up when I was in high school, I was very much resistant to public school because I saw it as just like a factory styled like education program where it was basically like train, obedience, command. They didn't teach you anything of substance. Like, there was no wood shop, there was no sewing class, there was no knitting class, there was no metal shop, there was nothing to teach you how to work on a car. Even for universities, it didn't properly prepare you. And even universities nowadays are just terrible. Like, it's just, I was always very resistant to establishments and institutions. Same thing with the Jehovah's Witnesses, where I was like, there's something wrong with this religion. There's something wrong with this school. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, obviously, because I was young. So anarchism started to become very palatable to me, because I would listen to classic rock music that would oftentimes reference anarchist principles of like, don't tell me what to do, I'll figure it out, I'll rule myself, and all of that jazz. Then I was introduced to communism by a couple of friends outside of university, where they were like actually, children of union members. They were people who were actually like advocating against businesses and against the concept of private property, stating how businesses will basically hoard private property to the detriment of the public. And then we'll have what we're having now in the United States, which is like entire subdivisions basically of houses being bought up by companies for rent, and how we're basically being transitioned into a renter's market. So all of that was kind of like issues that I had in my mind always as being problematic to society. However, despite the fact that I would see that as like the core truth of leftist politics, is basically tackling these massive institutions, or tackling like a bureaucracy or a religion that doesn't fully live up to Christ's message or doesn't represent the people. I started to observe how true communism or anarchism actually was. Like, I started to observe how people, like mass swaths of people, weren't wrong with their interpretation of communism or anarchism, whether it was in a university setting or whether it was in real life. Because although I disagree with them and I disagree with their intentions and their purposes, anarchism is, at the end of the day, depending on, which school of thought you go with, don't tell me what to do, and you can establish whatever choices you want using human rationale, essentially. The example that I like to use best is Diogenes, the Greek philosopher, where he basically took it to a huge degree of like experimentation, where he would go into like the public square completely naked, and he would start like doing stuff to himself to prove that he could just do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. And he took like a vow of homelessness to kind of say no one can tell him what to do. So he would like, basically poop in the streets and do whatever he wanted. And that is anarchism. Like that is like a way that people can interpret it. And moreover, when I ended up finding a school within anarchism that endorsed and normalized hurting children under the pretense of, with that manipulative language of children are autonomous beings who are oppressed by the authority of their parents, that through that like rhetoric, I was starting to understand how it was starting to be shaped, how no one having any authority whatsoever would then in charge a lot of disaster for humanity. And as for communism, I started to kind of notice how the cliche of like, look at how it's been implemented every time it's been tried. And not only that, if I'm trying to raise awareness of like what's going on here, like why is this constantly a narrative? Like if you go to like anarchist bookshops that are like brick and mortar bookshops in San Francisco, they sell copies of magazines that endorse hurting children as a means of anarchist literature. When I started noticing their lack of response and them saying, oh, you know, if you abolish capitalism, this will go away. I'm like, this is an evil that predates capitalism. Like this is something that has always existed, essentially. Capitalism can't possibly be the root of all evil that you see around, like prostitution and stuff like that. And I started observing how communism basically took hold in Cuba and China and all of these different countries. I started observing how it was once again a concept where, as I like to describe it, you're basically trying to do Christ's will on earth without Christ. So you're trying to help the poor, but you don't end up actually helping the poor. You create a new class of poor that you then excuse, whether it's through firing squads or gulags or whatever. You excuse their deaths essentially through their own human rationale, because they don't have a presence of God to value life. They only have the presence of this rhetoric of us versus them mentality to excuse a whole lot of deaths, even if it's within your own side. So that was kind of like my childhood idealism versus my adulthood reality.
Sí, sí, sí. Y bueno, ahí esto es una idea que tal vez para algunos es más fácil de comprender. Yo me demoré en entender la que es la influencia del cristianismo en todo el concepto de la dignidad humana. It's like if you have a God who becomes man, then it becomes way easier to understand why man has dignity by itself, because it's in the image of God. So you cannot hurt man, you cannot hold the human person, because if you're doing so, you would be acting against God. So it creates a much easier way to explain dignity to others, to educate others into the idea of dignity.
Yeah.
So, well, eso por un punto. El segundo también está el tema de que tú tienes experiencia práctica en estos grupos. La mayor parte de gente en grupos más de derecha, ya sean en grupos más libertarios o directamente tradicionalistas, son gente que no ha tenido esa experiencia, que no han tenido contacto real con la izquierda, aparte de los activistas que son muy vocales. You know, the ones that are very present into like the online sphere or either into like street protests or whatever. Entonces, más bien, tú que estás haciendo la transición de lo uno a lo otro, ¿qué es lo que te has dado cuenta de las comunidades más de derecha, al menos hasta ahora? Because I know that many people are terminally online on both sides, but
yeah. I would say that, you know, growing up, this divide, this schism between the left and the right wasn't really as present as it is now in adulthood. So I would be friends with people who were both on the left or on the right when I was a kid. And although I think I probably would have defined myself as being more on the left as a child as well, just because I was so feminist and anarchist and all of that jazz, I still got along well with whoever showed up and whoever I basically vibed with. The differences themselves were basically subject matter for us to kind of poke fun at and laugh at, basically. But it wasn't until like my generation started going to university where things started to really explode. And I would even say a little bit before then, like around 2014, I think is around when things started to get kind of bad. I guess with the advent of like how popular the internet was and how people going through puberty, people going through their adolescence, being the first generation completely online, it kind of starts to divide people amongst themselves. Like I remember it was a popular thing for Tumblr to be against Reddit and Reddit to be against Tumblr when I was like in adolescence. And I was like, I never understood that schism until adulthood. But I would say that the differences that I've acknowledged with the right is that they're not so, like, you could argue that they are ideologically driven, where if you're not a Christian, if you're not traditionalist, then you're not a part of their company. And the same argument can be placed on the left as well. I still hold that there's a lot of leftists who hold their position ideologically, but they won't let that impact their real life, because at the end of the day, what their objective is outreach programs, where they're trying to have you understand what might benefit you and the community and what might help others. And they try to go through a more charitable approach in a secular way. And with those leftists, I'm still friends with them. I still engage in, like, debates with certain ideas that we have. And like, I still have like a lot of my leftist friends. The ones that I don't have, I predicted that I would lose them, and I kind of wanted to. So I was like, great excuse, bye-bye. But for those on the right, they're very like, they value, from what I've observed from my experience with them, something that they've always like have appreciated is like loyalty to your friends, since being traditionalist tends to come with a sense of like nobility and loyalty and honor, and a sense of like organization and structure. It comes with a sense of like doing what's right, not because you want to be seen or you want to be like whatever, but it's because what is right. You have like an objective what's it called, binary sense of morality, where on the left it's more appreciated that it's like a morality is like either completely antithetical to their politics, or it's in a spectrum where it's like everything's very relative, everything's very subjective. There's no true sense of anything, because then that would go against a lot of the approaches that they might take, or a lot of the philosophies that they hold. Meanwhile, on the right, there is a binary sense of morality where it's like this is right and this is wrong. And through that, you can appreciate the predictability of someone on the right. You can appreciate the code of ethics that you can pretty much assume from them, where it's like, as long as we're being respectful, as long as we're being polite and considerate, as long as we're kind of being, service oriented to one another, there's going to be a great sense of mutual affection. Meanwhile, on the left, they'll consider all of those attributes as duplicitous unless you subscribe entirely to their ideology or usurp them in their ideology. And if you do usurp them, they feel self-conscious of themselves, because they feel like, oh, you see me as a false traitor to the movement or whatever, which shows that there's more loyalty to the ideology itself, in whatever shape it takes, because a lot of them aren't even acquainted with it fully, than to each other as comrades, you could say. So yeah, that's kind of been my observations on the right. It's like, it's more, even though the left calls themselves like humanists or humanitarians, it's like a euphemism. At the end of the day, it's very much an individualist movement based off of their own interpretations and their own rage. On the right is where you see a more human-based ideology of like, everyone take care of human needs based off of the grander scope of God, essentially, which promotes that true love for your man and a true sense of life and health and good nature, essentially.
Sí, sí, es algo que uno se da cuenta, pero también es un proceso, sobre todo cuando vas de una tendencia a otra, incluso en la propia derecha. Lo que decías, que hay un poco esa diferencia y que los grupos no son tan afines. You have libertarians, you have like proper conservatives, you have like trad cats inside the right, and on the left it's like pretty much everyone's on the same page hasta que tienen poder. Pero aquí va otra pregunta que tal vez, al menos yo me fijé en este cambio viendo tus videos más antiguos y ahora los más nuevos, es toda la parte estética, like the aesthetics of that. It's like right now some people have accused you of like putting a trad wife aesthetics and all of that. Y quería preguntarte cuál es tu opinión y cuál es tu perspectiva sobre la parte estética. Si es que hay una diferencia en cómo se ve la gente del un lado, cómo se ve la gente del otro, cómo te ves tú, cómo te sientes tú en la parte estética.
How do I observe aesthetically both the right and the left, and how do I fit into it?
And how do you feel about it, like yourself doing this transition from one side to the other?
I think it's funny when people say that I'm doing the whole trad wife thing, because I'm not dating anyone. I'm like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be traditionally married to in that respect. And it's not like I'm going out into like a milkmaid farm and like milking cows being like, this is for my children. It's just a measure of like, if, I don't know, I guess, honestly, when you reject liberal feminism, I still have a lot of sympathy for radical feminism. My only criticism is obviously that a lot of the group really does hate men. And they'll say, no, we don't hate men. We just see them as natural predators who want to kill us. And it's like, okay, so would you say you like them then? Like, if that's how you observe them? But I still have a lot of sympathy for them, because I understand why it is that they reach those conclusions. But when you reject liberal feminism particularly, they automatically call you like a pick-me, and they say that you're trying to be like not like other girls. This is something that they've always done since I was a kid, basically, where it's like, oh, you're against the whole 27-step makeup routine. That means that you think you're not like other girls. And it's like there's nothing honorable in like not being like other girls, but you're positioning me that way because you want me to basically normalize something that I've seen hurt psychologically a lot of little girls or whatever. Anyways, aesthetically speaking, I would say that leftism is very much marked by a popular word that I've heard used multiple times is dysgenic, where it's like the left will typically gear itself towards being more like just not necessarily well composed in features. Like they're not very well composed in their style. It's very much like a vomit of color, if that. And it's very much kind of like you could tell they haven't showered for like 3 or 4 days, maybe even a week. Like they're very much like mentally ill, very sick. Their skin maybe is not doing the greatest. And I say that as myself having had my periods of time where it's like you could totally tell that I was not very well in the head. But that's what kind of marks the left, is essentially people who haven't adapted well to society for one reason or another. And honestly, I blame our schooling system to this day. I blame our society in general for having failed my generation, for having basically failed this upcoming generation, where there was no strong front of like, no, like you're supposed to have structure and order. You're supposed to have a sense of prescribed roles for people to feel more comfortable adopting, and also the economy as well, with manufacturing jobs no longer being readily available. So anyways, that's a whole other tangent. Meanwhile, on the right, I think, and I knew this too when I was gonna like transition over, and people were already observing this. They were just kind of quietly observing it, and it was really annoying me how they were like already wanting to criticize me for having started to take more care in my appearance, for having basically composed myself, for not chopping my hair off all the time, even though that's not necessarily a bad look. But having long hair as a woman, especially if it's like well kept, typically is a sign of someone who's like, a lot of people will automatically start to kind of show like signs of mistrust in that. It's a very paranoid group of people where it's like they all have their own paranoias of aesthetics or whatever. So I would say, yeah, like the right tends to be a little more organized and composed. They tend to take better care of their appearance. Meanwhile, on the left, you can typically tell when someone is like not doing that well, essentially.
Sí, sí. Y bueno, yo me he puesto a pensar un poco en eso porque cuando eres hombre, un poco comenzar a dejarte la barba y demás, ese es un proceso difícil. Because that's like 1 week or something. And después de eso, toca tener cuidado con todo lo demás. También la parte de la apariencia, muchos procuramos vestirnos un poco más formales y demás. Y en la derecha, o al menos cuando eres joven, como que tienes ese impulso y esa presión de estar más informal, de estar más relajado, y más bien
Mm-hmm.
cuando vas creciendo te das cuenta de que no, o sea, la vida tiene que tener un poco más de orden, de sentido, de belleza en eso, y cierta, o sea, se requiere de cierta unidad, de cierta dirección, y no puedes tener eso si es que estás muy relajado. Es un
Mm-hmm.
poco el tema de madurar, y tal vez es aquí lo que te pregunto, si es que ves toda esta experiencia de dar el paso hacia una forma de ver el mundo distinta, es una forma de madurar. O sea, quería ver si es que esa es tal vez la lección que has tomado de todo el cambio.
I would say that when it comes to beards, I would say that I would encourage a return to beards for men, because I feel like it's an example of masculinity, especially if it's like well kept, obviously. But it's an example of like masculinity. It's an example of being more, I don't know, like aged, essentially, a sign of maturity, essentially. But as for maturity itself, I think that the idea of maturing nowadays is considered like antithetical, or it's considered oppressive for a lot of individuals who want to basically continue their adolescence into their 40s or 50s. And I've already seen individuals who think that they are still teenagers and yet they're like in their 40s or 50s. And these are people who are completely unreliable. These are people who tend to fail those around them. These are people who are essentially self-indulgent, and they tend to have problems in their life that could have been completely avoided if they had just adapted well as they aged. For example, they'll have like a lot of scandals or allegations or accusations. They'll have a lot of like problems psychologically. They'll like it. There's a reason why you're supposed to age with your peer group. There's a reason why you're supposed to keep up with the times. Um, so I think nowadays people are all trying to aim for essentially like stretching out their adolescence or their childhood to such degree where I remember I was at Costco yesterday and I saw this couple and they were like, I think they were older than me, and they were in the toy section buying toys for themselves. And although I understand, like, obviously, like, there's nostalgia in, wanting to get toys for yourself from your childhood and stuff like that, there's also something to be said that's really sad about a couple going to a toy store being older than me. So they were probably like, I don't know, late 20s, early 30s, buying toys only for themselves as a grown man and as a grown woman, where it's like the grown man was like, oh my God, we should get that Lego set for us. And I'm like, never in my days would our parents ever do that. And I think what's so sad about it is, what can you offer the next generation then? Like, if you're expecting society to basically gear itself towards you as an individual and cater itself towards you and your your commercialist or consumerist wants still as an adult, how are you going to protect the next generation? You're not going to care about kids. They're not going to be a responsibility in your eyes, because responsibility comes with maturity. So if you aren't equipped as an adult to be an adult, you won't have the capacity to protect kids. And worse off, as I've already observed, you'll think of yourself as a kid and think that these kids are essentially your peers, as we're already seeing with politics in the West, at least, where people are trying to basically pour their own childhood complexities or traumas into the children that are now growing up, saying, oh, well, in my childhood, I was experiencing this and this and that. So that means in your childhood, you should do this and this and that. Meanwhile, they don't have any children. Meanwhile, they don't have any inkling of like a stable, committed relationship. So how exactly can they navigate like anything that has to do with children when it's like you don't have the capacity to take on responsibility for this child if anything were to happen based off of the advice you're giving them? And it's just like, it's annoying. Like, I think there's a lot to tie in with maturity and responsibility and how it relates to making sure that children are okay in our day and age. Because like, returning back to the OnlyFans subject, there's a lot of girls who have reached out to me and they say that they regretted it. Like, whether they were not even just on OnlyFans, but whether they were posting photos of themselves on Twitter or on Tumblr or on wherever, whenever they would try to say like there's something wrong here, they would get self-conscious or insecure. They would realize that what they had done is basically give material for dirty people. Essentially, there was no one that they could really turn to, because they were then condemned and bullied into silence, being told, if you speak up, then you are going to be hurting other girls. You're going to be hurting the narrative. You're going to be hurting the industry. And they would quiet themselves down because this is a trauma that they don't understand how to navigate. So it's like you have this narrative of people saying, oh, well, I was sexually repressed and I was, told this modesty, purity culture. So now you have to go off and basically liberate yourself and empower yourself. They go off and do and take their advice. They go off and, post whatever. And then when they say, oh, this is a new trauma for me, this is something bad that's happened to me, those very same people will say, oh, you should have known better. You should have researched your whatever better. And they'll start to condemn them and bully them. And that's a narrative that immediately just made my skin curl. And I call the women who do that sort of narrative as they should be called, which is just madams, like Ghislaine Maxwell, the type of women who basically will exploit a young girl's confidence and trust with being in a female-centric space and use it against them essentially to benefit an industry. So yeah, that's kind of my opinion.
Sí, sí. Es un fenómeno que tal vez muchos de nosotros en la derecha no pensamos mucho, y es porque somos ignorantes del tema. Yo personalmente ignoro mucho de toda la cuestión, y es más que nada porque no le doy tanta importancia, porque tal vez hay el tabú de ponerse a pensar en qué es lo que hay detrás, cómo funciona, qué sucede. Entonces, más bien es bueno hablar con alguien que tenga más conocimiento. Yo creo que con eso podemos ir terminando. Si quieres hacer algún comentario más o dar algún mensaje a todos los que vean esta emisión, pues adelante.
I would say that my only message is try to practice, not really caring what other people think. We're living in a world where there's a lot of narratives, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of propaganda going around. Oftentimes, to reference Mal, most of it is just paper tigers, where it's like they'll look scary at front, they'll condemn you, they'll say plenty of things, but once you blow it over, you just reveal that it's been paper the entire time, essentially. Like, it's an illusion of strength, but it's not actual strength. The moment you call out their rhetoric, the moment you address where exactly they're coming from, and you don't even need to know necessarily where they're coming from in specific. You just have to show that you are an individual who are strong in your principles, and they'll leave you alone. But I also think that more people with a more traditionally based mind do need to start vocalizing their opinions more in the public without fear of what the mainstream or what their fellow peers might say, because at the end of the day, this is just a tide that comes from being young on the internet. But all of these people who are loud and who are vocal are very, very, very ignorant, and their emotions are usually not rooted in anything more than just egoism or a sense of wanting power for themselves. Um, when you come at society with a more traditional lens, you can help suck out all the poison that is basically infecting our society. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be vindication in that. There's going to be a sense of you spoke the truth as a group. You pushed forward that truth that can then protect more and more people from falling into these traps that we're seeing nowadays. That people who are vocal and loud and making this huge scene and being duplicitous about their morality are setting for especially the younger people nowadays.
Con eso creo que podemos terminar. Muchísimas gracias, Angélica. Ha sido un gusto tenerte. Espero que esto sea útil para difundir, para que todos tus seguidores, también para que la gente que ve regularmente el canal conozca más sobre ti, conozca de toda tu transición de un lado al otro lado del espectro de la política y de la religión, y pues que sirva para inspirar a más gente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for having me. I hope you have a good day today. Bye.